wanted to keep it a little bit looser, and I really wanted to ground it in our experiences. Um, the focus is really around leadership decisions, whether it's about leading a classroom and the decisions we have to make around AI as the leader of a learning community that lives inside of a classroom, or whether we are maybe leaders of a department or a grade level that's grappling with AI and the realities of it, or maybe we are leading a building or an entire school or system. Um, I've had to step into some different leadership roles over the last 2 years that put me in really unexpected situations. And I have to say that if it wasn't for my professional learning network, I might have really blown some stuff up. And I thought I would start by sharing some of the complexities that I've grappled with as a leader quickly, some stories. And then what I really want to do is give us a frame for thinking about leadership opportunities and tensions together so that all, both of you who are in the room and Rick, you too, we could really maybe have a conversation and support one another, and maybe leave with some tangible approaches for opportunity chasing and problem solving, if that makes sense. If you have specific questions, interests, or needs that you're bringing into this room, though, go ahead and drop them into the chat because it's really going to guide how the next hour unfolds for all of us. I wanted to start here with some storytelling. Um, when AI kind of crashed on the scene, the Bureau of Education and Research reached out to me and asked if I would be willing to run AI for English teacher workshops through their organization. And it was so new to me that I made a very loose commitment. And I said that I wasn't yet sure where I stood ethically with AI, but I was willing to explore the potential to put a program together. And in hindsight, I find that this is something I keep coming back to over and over again. My lack of certainty is actually, I think, my greatest strength as a leader inside of any room, because all of this has been so incredibly humbling. And every time I feel like I have a certain perspective, something happens that completely upends, that experience. The first experience that I had with AI in a leadership role was when I began designing that program for Bear and thinking about what English teachers would be interested in. And as so many organizations do, their concern was really about putting people in the room and making sure the marketing materials around my workshop read a certain way. They wanted to be able to attract teachers who were all about the efficiency and the tools. And if you look at even the brochure for these sessions, what's discomforting is it's all about a million promises and opportunities around AI. And I found that I had to keep pushing back really hard. And so when people come to professional learning experiences with me, I always start with that matrix. And that might be useful to you. And I always start by inviting people to think about their AI identity first. Doesn't matter what the context is or where I'm leading, trying to really help people feel comfortable owning the fact that they might not be certain, and that, trying to really get a sense of what do I value and how do I ensure that I'm using AI in a way that aligns with my values. So you might change, right? The indicators that are on that axis. That matrix for me is built around natural intelligence and agency. Your AI identity might be different. Inviting students to play with it at the middle school or high school level could really be interesting too. And then thinking about each quadrant, if you change those axes, how does it change the way you might describe each of those quadrants? When I came to work that next fall, I was asked to step into the role of executive director of distance education at Damon, and AI fell under my purview. And what was not surprising was that the humanities side of our university, all of the instructors, all of our faculty in the humanities courses were livid and terrified of AI and very concerned about academic integrity issues. Our health sciences folks were stoked about the potential for AI to create all sorts of health solutions for people. And our business folks were also very excited about using AI to give our students an edge in the field of business and marketing, especially, right? So I had to negotiate these conversations. And in a minute, I'm going to show you some of the tools that I use to facilitate agreements. I learned very early on that it doesn't make sense to try and finesse people into thinking differently about this and so many things because it's really asking them to violate their values or change their values. But what we can reach are agreements about how we're going to respect one another and not compromise or undermine kids' ability to be successful. One of the things that can be very challenging is when one teacher, perhaps in an English department, is using AI in some of the ways that I've been demonstrating, where I'm using it, and it's happening this week. I'm teaching sociolinguistics. I have a colleague who's teaching the same class. Her students are not getting that amount of feedback, and her students are not getting it as fast. She will not have feedback back to her students on our research papers for 5 more days. Because I used AI, my students received their feedback yesterday and this morning, and they have 5 additional days to compose. If you're looking at my matrix, that's a real good example of privileged use.
Mm.
And that's problematic for me. And I'm not sure how to solve that problem because if you're working with people who maybe don't value AI or are very much against it, and their students are not getting the same advantage, a conversation and reaching some agreements is really necessary. And I believe that there's a place where we can elegantly open the conversation around how is Angela using this? And would you be willing to use it in this way if it's going to give your students faster feedback that's more actionable, and it's going to provide more time for them to write? I'm pretty confident that my colleague is going to be really receptive to that because oftentimes when people are locking down around the use of AI, I'm finding it's for two different reasons. They're understanding the global and historical implications of what this is going to do to humanity. And it's terrifying, and they don't want to be a part of that because there's a lot of bad. And I have to respect that. So they're taking a stand. We're just not going to use AI at all. Or they're looking at bad use cases and they're assuming that that's all you do with it. And they don't want to use it in those cheap and sort of awful ways. I think if I'm willing to share how I'm using it and be willing to take the heat a little bit, we might achieve some agreements. However, there is a protocol that I've designed to facilitate that work a little bit better. And I'm going to share it with all of you in a minute. The next thing that I got myself involved with in terms of a leadership experience was I was responsible for facilitating policy and position statements for my university, which put me in rooms with attorneys, which I did not expect. And I learned a lot in those rooms that we're not talking about very often in open forums. Like, for instance, if students or faculty are using AI tools, and they're signing up or subscribing using their school affiliated email accounts, whatever they do with those AI tools can put the system at risk, at least in the United States. And I can't imagine it's too different where you come from. And so our university needed to look at that head on, and we needed to create an honest policy And I was very fortunate in that my university leaders and all of our faculty wanted to maintain an open AI use policy. And they also wanted to give our faculty members complete control over the degree to which they were using AI in their own courses and classrooms. So we have a position statement that is for the entire university. And we have policy around academic integrity that has been nuanced in the world of AI, but each of our faculty members also creates course level policies. They're required to be in the syllabi, and they're required to speak assignment by assignment about the degree to which AI will be used. When we go into the handbook, I'm going to show you where you can find some of those position and policy statements so that you can adapt them for your own use if that's something that you're interested in. Last fall, I found myself in a different leadership position when I taught a course with a student who aims to be a teacher, and she is actually a TA in a school right now. It became abundantly clear to me very rapidly that this student had a significant learning disability that she either was not revealing to me or was not aware of having. And so her ability to be successful in the course was very low. However, it became very clear about halfway through the semester that she was using AI to generate all of her lessons and all of her units. And one thing that I learned in this experience, it reminded me about the importance of standards, competencies, or outcomes. If my standard, competency, or outcome requires that students are producing original writing or original work, they can't use AI to generate it because I'm not able to assess if they're capable of doing it. In this case, my course was requiring that my student be able to demonstrate their ability to design a lesson plan independently in a unit, which is fair. She was using AI to do it. That really violated academic integrity, and it made it hard for me to know whether or not she met our learning outcomes. I also took it really personally when that happened. I got mad, like everybody does. I didn't say anything to her, and I was very grateful that night. I had had a Zoom call scheduled with my friend Gary Height, and Gary had had a similar situation earlier in the year. And he told me to temper my anger and try to get curious and approach my student with a curious posture instead of a shaming, blaming, or an angry posture. And that is what I did. So I came back to her and I said, I'm looking at the work that's been produced here. And when I put it against the process work that you did in class, there's a lot of difference here. And I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about how that happened. And she said that she used AI. She admitted it. And I said, I don't want to be punitive. I got to tell you, though, this is the situation that I'm in. I needed to know that you were capable of generating this lesson plan on your own. And I don't have that certainty yet. So I can't confidently say that you've met our course outcomes. She said, I really understand. And further investigation uncovered the fact that she was in an abusive relationship. She had just fled her home with her child, and she was relying on AI to generate those plans because she didn't have the time or the mental capacity or the emotional capacity to really sink into that work. That conversation allowed me to give her an incomplete instead of failing her. And I think often about what the unintended consequences would have been if I just failed her, accused her of academic dishonesty, and shamed her for using AI. But because I approached her with a sense of curiosity and wonder, and I was respectful toward her, even as I was setting a really clear boundary, I learned something that helped me lead in that situation much better. I also have a colleague at Damon who has a significant learning disability that she never talks about, but it impairs her ability to compose writing well. And she is in a leadership position. And anytime she sends an email, I know that she struggles to be taken seriously and to be respected and heard by sometimes other leaders because of her compositional skills. She uses AI now to generate her emails, and it has had a profound effect on her ability to be heard and taken seriously. I think of this often. The fact that when composition is not the objective, in certain content areas, print creates a huge barrier for students to be able to communicate what they know and are able to do. And so AI can really level a playing field in that particular way. And that's been hugely important. Lastly, I work with pre-service special education teachers every fall and every spring. In the spring, I was really concerned about the fact that I had 21 students in my classroom who were all 21 years old, and they are all entering classrooms next week. They all got jobs, and they are about to be special education teachers to probably the most complex generation of elementary school students that we have ever known. I don't have a toolkit to work with students like this. I can't come up with interventions off the top of my head. And what I was finding in my special education literacy classes was that my students had huge stereotypes. Whenever I asked them to create a prototype of a student with a learning disability, all of them had dyslexia or ADHD. And all of them were generalizing about what it looked like to have dyslexia or ADHD. And all of the interventions that they were creating were really not very attuned to, the really complex needs of human beings who may carry these labels, but what they really mean about the person is that they're really complicated. And what it looks like to meet those needs is complicated. So I coached my special education students to use AI to put very specific criteria into a chatbot about their students. My student has ADHD. The dominating feature of my students' ADHD is not their hyperactivity, but instead their rejection sensitivity dysphoria. In addition to that, and incidentally, most of my students don't even know what that is. They just pulled it off the IEP, right? But dominant is rejection sensitivity dysphoria. They also have autism. They're on the autism spectrum, and inherent in how it's expressed and how autism shows up in their lives is really around anxiety, social isolation, but they are not necessarily stimming in class, and they are not necessarily experiencing some of the things that are on that wheel. What we need are tools that we can use as leaders and as teachers to ask ChatGPT, if I'm working with someone who is this complex and these are their complexities, and this is the general lesson, how do I differentiate it tomorrow for this student? And what the output has been so incredibly nuanced. And we've spoken at length about the fact that you need to share this with colleagues in your building. You need to have networks of teachers online that you can reach out to and say, hey, I don't know anything about RSD. This is what I'm hearing. I could try. What do you think? Right? Now more than ever, our human learning networks are going to help us vet the information that we get. So these are the stories I wanted to open with when I'm thinking about what leadership around AI has looked like in my world. Those are the things I find myself stepping into and out of. And what I want to leave you with today are some very tangible tools, resources, and tactical approaches to really take this thing that is so ambiguous and also overwhelming, and to be able to lead within it in a way that it feels really rewarding for you. So take a minute and reflect on the stories I've shared. And then if you would, go into the chat and think a little bit about your own leadership positionality. What are the things that are coming up for you? What opportunities are you trying to chase? Or what challenges are you facing? Whether you're leading in a classroom, in a community, in a building, in a an entire board or district. In the chat, tell me what your leadership lens is looking like with AI. What's your interest here? Go ahead and take a minute and let me know that in the chat. You can also unmute. We're a small group. Yeah. Well, Jane, to be honest, I'm creating that privilege myself, even this week. I think so often, even when we're using AI, especially when we're using it in really meaningful and productive ways that serve learners well, if everybody on my grade level, in my department, in my team isn't doing that, there are going to be haves and have nots. That's happening to me this week. I'm creating that situation, but I also want to experiment with it in this way. My hope is that I can very quickly kind of deliver the receipts to my colleagues and say, look at how well this went. Look at how well it helped my students learn and write better. If you want to try, I'm happy to help you, next term when we try this again. Or even if you want to do it in a different class. I think so much of this is going to be about being willing to share the good stuff and being willing to even give our work away so that other people will be able to kind of leap off of it. But I think there's going to be a lot of privilege, and I think sometimes it's just that I'm aware of it, right? And I'm going to try and mitigate it. If I wasn't willing to try though, and I just don't know how to try without creating the privilege sometimes. Rick. It does improve every day. It is, and I don't know how many of you have been playing with it for a long time. It is dramatically different now than it was when I first started using it. ChatGPT had a lot of criticism around hallucination. There's a tool that I like a great deal called You. I'm not certain if many of you are familiar with it. It's a favorite of mine. If you click on the research tab in You, it actually will cite its sources. So I'll share my screen and I'll demo it for you because it's worth it if you're not familiar. We'll go here really quick. Yeah. So it's called You. When you go here, it says, what will you tackle today? And I will say something like what we've been researching. Define diglossia, which is a sociolinguistics concept, and distinguish it from code switching, something we're talking about in my class this week. And if you look here at the bottom, you'll see there's a tab called Research. When you click on that, look at what it does when it's producing its output. It's showing you the sources that it's pulling from. And then when it starts to generate a response, it's going to cite those sources and provide me the links so that I can look at the output that it was and the data. So here it's distinguishing what diglossia is, comparing it to code switching, and then you see these little footnotes. I can click on these, and when they open, it's going to take me directly to the source. It gives me a little thumbnail, and then if I want to go look more, I can actually click on it and open it up. It's these tools, when Rick's talking about how they keep getting better, that are building confidence with people. There's another tool that I'm not sure all of you are familiar with called NotebookLM, and it's actually a Google tool. It works a lot like Drive. NotebookLM is a space where you can collect a folder full of resources, PowerPoint slides, research articles. If I were a fifth grade student, I could have my teacher's slide deck. I could have workbook pages, website content, some maybe articles that I was asked to read on force and motion. And what Notebook LM does is it synthesizes all of those sources and it creates a notebook for students to study from. In addition, Once that notebook is completed, students can actually engage with human AI voices and ask for clarification, and it will teach them concepts in real time. So I encourage you to look up NotebookLM because that's another tool that is a really good example of how AI is improving rapidly. And the things that we were concerned about, things like hallucinations, U takes care of that. I can look at the original source and I can vet that information really well. When I think about it being used as an instructional tool, tools like Notebook LM are really creating beautiful contexts that are unique to specific students and where they come from. So in the example that I looked at, a fifth grade student had created a notebook around force and motion. And Notebook LM turned all of these handouts and classroom resources into this gorgeous multimedia chapter or notebook. And then as he was studying, he could ask the human bot to give him examples that were related to basketball. And it sounded like a podcast, and he was able to talk to those voices. So there is a video available if it's something you're interested in. I'll dig it out of my our archives, and I'll make sure that I send it along to Rick, but it is improving over time. Um, all right. I'm really embracing the viewpoint. I'm looking at what Jane is sharing here. Are you seeing students improving with their writing in a big way? I truly am. And I'll share this with you so that you have a context for how I know they're not using AI to generate their work. I'm actually a huge proponent of a process called pedagogical documentation, which some of you might be really well aware of. When we document our learning, what happens is that I might be teaching around a very specific concept. And what I do is I stop during my class and I ask my students to take pictures during class of when their thinking changed, when their learning changed, or when their work was changing. And those photos serve as evidence of their learning process. I'm going to share my screen with you all really quick. As a leader, I cannot imagine teaching in an AI world without documenting learning. And so this is a tool called Unruler. But what I ask my students to do often is while I'm teaching, I ask them to take pictures of things that are happening during our learning experience that are shifting their thinking, that are shifting the way that they produce their work and the way that their writing is changing. It's a highly reflective process. So if you look at Jacqueline's last post from last semester, she took a picture of the documentation kaleidoscope that we were learning about in class. She took a picture of some visuals of standards-based grade books that we were exploring. These are reflections that she made in class as she was doing some research. We were learning how to build a learning wall. What Jacqueline had to do was create a research-based presentation, and she had to make that presentation at our Future Educator Symposium. What she did all semester was she documented her learning moments. So she took a picture of something we were exploring together in class. She reflected on why that was important to her as a learner and how it was shaping her work. Documentation throughout an entire semester gives me a real eye into how my students are actually making sense of the concepts that we're studying and the processes that we're working through. So when you ask me if my students' writing is improving dramatically, it is. And I'm confident that they're not just using AI to produce that better writing, because I have such a window into how they are growing, because we're documenting the process. I'm not just grading the products of learning, if that makes sense. Thoughts or questions about that? Feel free to unmute and just talk if you want to. Let me sit with it for a minute, right? So I had asked if you were interested, um, if you would put some of the things that you're grappling with as a leader into the chat. Where I want to kind of direct you is when you came into the room. I've been sharing this handbook for some time, but I'm going to direct you to page 11. And it's the table of contents. And there are some different things inside of this book that might be very useful to you from a leadership perspective, particularly part 1. What I'm finding so important in my leadership work is, before I'm talking about whether AI is good or bad, whether we should or shouldn't use it, I very rarely evangelize about it and I don't push it on people. Before we do any of that, we need to have a shared vision. How you feeling about this? We need to hear from everybody in a grade level or in a department or in the room, in a building. And if we can get everyone, sticky notes are a great resource for this, to just share out on a sticky note, here's how I'm really feeling about it. Create a wall or a table where they can sort of create and plot a data point about comfort level. On one end of that scale, level 1, not comfortable at all. In fact, totally not going to use it. And at the other end, level 10, I'm an early adopter. But on the sticky note, they put why. When we can get everyone's voice on that table, you can start to notice trends or patterns in those sticky notes. And that can help you draw conclusions and start to establish hunches about why are most people uncomfortable and what inspired someone to be an early adopter. That can help you create a vision of your current reality instead of just, generalities. And I find myself doing it all the time. I'll generalize, right? Like Rick and I were laughing about the fact that his son Brent is constantly messaging me about how much he hates AI. And Brent and I are friends. And so I could reach these huge, conclusions. Well, Brent just hates it. That sort of generalization is not useful, and it's also not a respectful or a helpful interpretation of who he is. He has good reasons for that. And so that sort of activity where you just put a comfort line up, whether it's with your students, with parents, with a group that you're leading in any context. Level 1, I hate this thing. I'm never going to touch it. It terrifies me. It angers me that other people are using it. Level 10, I'm an early adopter and I'm doing all of this fabulous stuff. But what really matters is that sticky note. And when everyone shares how they're thinking and feeling, as a leader, you start to identify those trends. And if you learn that most people are skeptical because they haven't seen good applications, they have really bad use cases. So, of course, they hate it. You know that you can start to get them connected to better examples, and you can get other people's stories on the table. And maybe there will just be very specific ways that we use it. Or maybe you'll decide as a leader, we're not going to use it at all because what you're seeing in that data makes sense to you and you don't want to move forward. But until you actually hear from the people you're leading, it's going to be difficult to actually understand what's going on. So when you look at page 17, this is a toolkit for shared visioning work. And if you click on either this document or these words, this is the process that I used at Damon University. I wanted to begin by collaboratively defining how people were feeling about AI. I wanted them to be able to share out what their experiences and their own values were around this. But one of the things that was really helpful for mitigating the tension, and what you're going to find is that inside of this document or folder, which I'll share in a minute, these scenarios were really helpful. So if you know that you're walking into a really loaded situation where there are very strong feelings about AI, you want people to be able to be honest and to talk, but you know that if one person shares their experience, other people might take fire or it might actually create more tension, scenarios can be really helpful. So when I facilitated that protocol, I shared these different scenarios of AI use, and it allowed us to open conversations that were not specific to the people on our campus. Like these were sort of examples and people and scenarios that were far away from us, but that allowed us to have the conversation without feeling like we might offend someone else in the room. When you look at that Bear handbook, the protocol is here, the scenarios are here as well. And when you open them, they're all Google Docs. So if you want to change them, you can go to File, make a copy, and you can adapt this and make it your own. And that I have found to be such an important part of beginning leadership work around AI. This protocol is useful for with teams and departments and entire school buildings. It also can be helpful to adapt for use with parent groups, and you can use it with students too, especially if you teach at upper element or upper middle school or high school levels. I want to stop and give you a minute to drop your thoughts about that into the chat. What are your questions or what's resonating when you think about doing visioning work? Drop your response into the chat if you would.
Can I speak
Or
instead of writing?
unmute. Yeah, please do. I feel less lonely that way.
First, in reference to the first discussion you were having, my PLC, we had Kristen yesterday in this workshop. Kristen
Mhm.
and I work together. So she teaches grade 6 and 7. I teach 8, 9, 10.
Mhm.
And Kristen is very techy. And so we kind of clicked because I'm not very techy. However, um, we were starting to use Brisk
Yeah,
and other AI,
I'm
some other
familiar with it.
AI tools, and it's working really well. And so the other teacher that teaches grade 11 and 12, she was also on board. So our PLC was great because we're learning together and
Yeah,
we're embracing it. Now, I am not, I mean, this workshop is excellent because I'm learning more, but the more I learn, the better I get and the better I can help others. However, there are other teachers that I know will definitely not um, be
use
on
it.
board,
Yeah,
you know, and it's okay. Um, but just having at least my PLC
yeah.
use it, it's just it works for
And I
us.
have to be honest, and I know that there are other people that don't agree with my perspective here. These are my values, right? And I'm just sharing my opinion. And I respect people who have others. There are lots of people who kind of maintain a burn it to the ground attitude over progressive practices and technology. Everybody should be doing it, and if they don't want to do it, we're just going to blow them up. Like it's bad for kids. They should be used. Everybody should be a progressive educator. Burn it to the ground, right? And these are the teachers who during COVID or even professional learning facilitators. I had a friend during COVID who bought a t-shirt that said, I told you so. She was a tech integrator and she worked with lots of teachers who were resistant to using technology. So when COVID came, everyone's panicking. And of course, the tech evangelists in my world are all like, we've been trying to get people to use it for years. We've been telling them, right? That's not where I come from at all. I tend to maintain this pretty zen perspective, or at least I try to, about life. And the fact is that we are all human beings, and every human being has had different life experiences, good, bad, some very traumatic, that influence the way they interpret situations. And the fact is that I will go to my grave with there being haves and have nots around technology and AI. There will always be people who are not interested or willing to use it. There will always be these haves and have nots. Um, and I guess that's life, right? So much of life is about disparity and inequity. And like in the moment, if I were in your situation and I knew that there were lots of other people in my school who weren't embracing it, it always comes down to this. Do I want to ruin my relationship with that person? What matters more, that kids are using technology and AI, or that their teachers all are good to each other? That's a really important question to ask. Does it matter that one of, people I admire in the field think that this thing is of the devil, and they're never going to use it? Do I have to be right? Does it matter that I'm right? Or does it matter that I'm willing to protect my relationship with people? I got to tell you, there might come a day around AI where I have to think better and differently about that. But right now, I'm not willing to blow up relationships with people because I think that AI is like some great thing. But I do want to be able to say it for myself. I do want to be able to identify that I'm using it in a way that is privileging my students. And other students who have a different instructor, they're not getting the benefit of this. So why does that matter? It matters when we go to a department meeting. Well, here's what really concerns me. My students' scores might end up being higher. Their grades might be better because I've been able to go through 4 feedback cycles with them, and their grades might end up being better. And my colleague's grades, her students' grades might be lower. Do you know that we have an enrollment cliff in higher education? In 2026, we're supposed to see a 600% decrease in student enrollment in the United States in all of our universities and colleges. We are cutting positions all over the place. I'm very concerned that if my scores are higher, it's going to reflect poorly on my colleague. And someone might say, hey, we could just like move her into a different scenario or cut her position entirely. I have to be willing to speak up in that meeting and say, oh no, I had this added edge that had nothing to do with my ability to teach better than my colleague. Right? Like I really invoked the machine. So much of this is about our own personal integrity. Are we using it with integrity? Are we owning it when we're using it? Are we making sure that people know that that wasn't necessarily, I didn't provide 12 paragraphs of feedback on my students' work in 1 hour 4 times? Like I have to be willing to say that, right? And it's going to be tough for sure. Other things that people are resonating with or that they have questions about. I think that that's a piece of it too, Rick, right? Like, I think that there are a lot of people who are very defensive, perhaps, and they're worried that, they don't know how to use it or they're not comfortable with technology. And so much of this, like, I don't know, it reminds me of other things I think on often in education where when I came up as a teacher, it was all Madeline Hunter all the time. And if my 80% of my students weren't hitting my course objective by the time they walked out of the classroom every day, I was a bad teacher. There was this just heavy evaluative perspective that we brought to teaching. And teachers were supposed to know everything and they were supposed to do it perfectly. And I think it's made, especially people in my generation, hesitant to say, I don't know how to do that, or I'm not sure, or I'm not an expert. And so I think that that feeds that sort of panic. People don't want to reveal that they're not comfortable with it if they're afraid they're going to be judged. And so then there's a lot here that we could latch onto instead. Well, it's just bad for humanity. It's just bad in general. But now we're getting to a point where the people who are being so openly critical about it in the field, like big researchers and people who are scholars I admire, it's really their criticism is really revealing a lack of understanding. And I think that that defensiveness is actually doing more harm than good at this point, to some extent. I do have friends though who are critics that help me think better about this. Jen Fletcher is one of them. She wrote Writing Rhetorically. I adore her and we are very good friends. And Jen came to Camp Rewrite this summer to talk with me about AI. She is not a fan. And one of the things that she suggested to me that I thought was so beautiful was that people are using humanistic terms to talk about artificial intelligence. So they're using tools in ways that they're saying things like, well, I'm going to give this to Claude, and Claude's going to tell me how to do this better. And I just love my friend Claude. And Jen's like, that's where it really starts to cross the line for me, is when in our language, we're humanizing these tools because our language matters. And so we should not be using humanistic terms. We should always be clear that this is a machine, that this is a technology. And when we start humanizing that technology, we're really shifting the culture. And as someone who teaches sociolinguistics, I deeply appreciate that nuance, right? So I think that there's also this place where we can learn so much from people who don't share our perspective. Jen also brings, and this is a really helpful and useful leadership tool as well. Jen brings a rhetorical lens to conversations about AI, and she talks about thinking with the grain and then thinking against the grain. So it was her that taught me that when we're thinking about AI, the first thing that we should do is think about opportunities, think about where we agree, think about what could work. But then we also have to take care to criticize what could go wrong. Where do we disagree? What is really dangerous about this? So, with the grain and against the grain is a beautiful lens, like to offer to groups that are grappling, I think, with tension too. Anyone else want to ask anything or share something that they're noticing? And a conversation around AI as a collaborator in your learning. Yeah, that's why I really love NotebookLM, and it creeps people out big time. And maybe because we have a few minutes and our group is small, I think we're going to end. I want to end by showing you the demo video for NotebookLM. I just need to find it real quick. It's in my messages. It was actually Brett Vogelsinger who sent this to me when it first came out. And I was absolutely blown away by what he shared. Give
Don't
me
forget to
one.
share your audio when you share that before you play the
Yeah,
video.
I will.
I refer, we had this conversation around collaborating, and there was dissension in the group. And I said, well, I think I'm comfortable saying I collaborated with Chat GPT in refreshing my Japanese because I was engaged in a conversation I could question and challenge back and forth. Like I was using the audio components of it to, is this how I would say this best? And then I would say something in Japanese and it's come back and say, well, no, maybe this. And I'm like, yeah, but this word means this. And we're going back and forth in a collaborative learning structure.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I have this thing that I want to share with you. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to leave. We're going to end with a peek into NotebookLM because I really see this as a tool that has such potential, but it is also the sort of thing that is really scaring people too. And I think that it can be a tool that we use for leadership work, almost as an artifact of AI that can open conversations. And if you build protocols into debriefing what you're about to see, I think that it can lead to some really profound conversations. Okay, so here we go. Let me know if you can't hear this once I start it.
Hey everyone. Last year at I/O, we introduced NotebookLM, a research and writing tool grounded in the information you give it. Since then, we've seen a lot of momentum with students and teachers using it. And today, Gemini 1.5 Pro is coming to NotebookLM, and it's great. Let me show you. So here we are in NotebookLM. You can load it up with all the materials here on the left. In this notebook, I've been using it with my younger son, and I've added some of his science worksheets, a few slide decks from his teacher, and even an open source textbook full of charts and diagrams. With 1.5 Pro, it instantly creates this notebook guide with a helpful summary and can generate a study guide, an FAQ, or even quizzes. But for my son, Jimmy, he really learns best when he can listen to something. So we've prototyped a new feature with Gemini and it's called Audio Overviews. NotebookLM is going to take all the materials on the left as input and output them into a lively science discussion personalized for him. Let's take a listen.
So let's dive into physics. What's on deck for today?
Well, we're starting with the basics, force and motion.
Okay.
And that, of course, means we have to talk about Sir Isaac Newton and his 3 laws of motion.
Ah, yes, the foundation for understanding how objects move and interact.
Ah, yes, this is where multimodal really shines. Now, it generated this audio discussion based on that text material. And what's amazing is that my son and I can join into the conversation and steer it whichever direction we want. When I tap, join.
Hold on, we have a question. What's up, Josh?
Yeah, can you give my son Jimmy a basketball example?
Hey, Jimmy! That's a fantastic idea. Basketball is actually a great way to visualize force and motion. Let's break it down.
Okay, so first, imagine a basketball just sitting there on the court. It's not moving, right? That's because all the forces acting on it are balanced. The downward pull of gravity.
Pretty cool, right? I gotta say, the first time my son heard this, you should have seen how big his eyes got because he was gripped. They were talking to him. He was learning science through the example of basketball, his favorite sport. Now, what's interesting is under the hood, you saw that Jim and I had used some of the concepts of gravity, Sir Isaac Newton, but nothing in there was about basketball. It connected the dots and created that age-appropriate example for him. And this is what's becoming possible with the power of Gemini. You can give it lots of information in any format, and it can be transformed in a way that's personalized and interactive for you. Back to you, Sundar.
All right. So I'm going to stop sharing. That freaks people out every time I show it to them. But it also, I think, has serious implications for all of us because that's how fast this is moving. And also, that's a huge opportunity for kids. Like I think of, and my daughter gives me permission to share this, my oldest has ADD. And when she went to college, she did really well in every single course that was specific to her interests. She's a designer. But anything that required heavy reading and writing that was not something of particular interest to her, she had a very difficult time cutting through those courses. If she had been able to access the information this way, not only the shift in modality, but also the ability to engage, a tool, like give me an example in a context that I actually understand, I have a feeling that college would have been a far different experience for her. This again comes back to being aware of our competencies and our outcomes for a particular session or lesson. Because if it's important, like if this is a reading comprehension lesson and the competency is all about reading print, we can't use NotebookLM necessarily in that way. Go ahead. Yeah.
So tell me something. How do you feel about, let's say with, what's this, NotebookLM? If all the students in my class had the opportunity to use it, not just those who may have a specific disability or something. Because I asked that because we use the immersive reader for our students who may have challenges with reading. Now, I started out just giving it to those students, and then I went and gave it to the whole class. Like, if you want to use it, you can go ahead and use it. However, when it came down to, let's say, the PAT or specific testing, only those who were deemed,
who had that particular modification,
yes, could use it. So I always grapple with, should everyone have access to it? Or
I think that this perspective might be helpful, maybe not, but I'll share it and it might help. As someone who has, like, literacy is my jam, and most of the work that I do here in Buffalo is about improving performance on standardized assessments. And what we have found time and again is that we can't run the marathon every day. The test is the marathon. But to be able to run the marathon well, I need to sharpen their literacy skills. And their literacy skills can only be sharpened if I have a richly multimodal approach in the classroom. Kids do not learn how to read unless they can hear and speak the words that they're supposed to be consuming. So decoding and encoding, the process of writing, demands being able to see it, say it, hear it, write it. The more we have tools in our daily instruction that allow kids to see it, say it, hear it, write it, the more robust their literacy skills become, so that when they get to the test, they're coming in with far sharper literacy skills. You don't sharpen that saw unless you have a richly multimodal daily experience, because it is in decoding and encoding and other, many more comprehension experiences, and culture has a lot to do with it too. But the fact is that what happens day to day in the classroom needs to be dynamic and richly multimodal. That's how you build kids who are able to produce and consume better print. That gets them ready for the test. But the test is really about, can they consume and produce the print? So they're going to remove those tools in that moment. That doesn't mean that using them is inequitable, though. So I hope that clarifies. So I want to encourage all of you. You have that notebook. My contact information is in that handbook. And I hope that you'll stay in touch with me. I keep saying this at the end of every session. I hope that now at the end of the fourth, you're sensing that I'm kind of an experimental monkey with all of this. I'm just still learning myself. And I don't know what, perfect looks like at this point. I do walk into lots of contexts where people tell me they're not going to use it. And when I hear what their reasoning is and why they're not going to use it, I wouldn't use it in that context either. But hopefully I've shared some good examples and some stories. And if you need a friend in the work, just reach out. I'm happy to talk more anytime. And I would love to have other people to bounce ideas off of as I go myself. So it's great to meet all of you. Thanks for being here.